Please stand for the reading of the gospel. Our gospel reading this morning is Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. If you'd like to join in your pew Bible, it can be found at page 877. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together with all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judea. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people of Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. The Gospel of the Lord.
Jesus, I am overjoyed to meet you face to face. You've been getting quite a name all around the place. Healing cripples, raising from the dead. Now I understand your God.
Huh?
At least that's what you've said. So, you are the Christ, you're the great Jesus Christ. Prove to me that you're divine. Change my water into wine. That's all you need do. Then I'll know it's all true. Come on, King of the Jews. Jesus, you just won't believe the hit you've made around here. You are all we talk about. You're the wonder of the year. Oh, what a pity if it's all a lie. Still, I'm sure that you can rock the cynics if you try. So if you are the Christ, yes, the great Jesus Christ, prove to me that you're no fool. Walk across my swimming pool. If you do that for me, then I'll let you go free. Come on, King of the Jews. I only ask what I'd ask any superstar. What is it that you have got that puts you where you are? Oh, I am waiting. Yes, I'm a captive fan. I'm dying to be shown that you are not just any man. So if you are the Christ, yes, the great Jesus Christ, feed my household with this bread. You can do it on your head. Or has something gone wrong? Jesus, why do you take so long? Oh, come on, King of the Jews! Hey, aren't you scared of me, Christ? Mr. Wonderful Christ! You're a joke! You're not the Lord! You are nothing but a fraud. Take him away. He's got nothing to say. Get out, you king of the... Get out, king of the... Oh, get out, you king of the Jews! Get out of here! You... Get out of here, you! Get out of my life!
The past few weeks, including today, we are in the Advent season. The season where we are awaiting the birth of Christ, awaiting Christmas morning. We are waiting we are anticipating, we are preparing for God, for Jesus to enter our world and indeed our hearts. And 2 weeks ago, I started a series, if you will, of asking you questions. Really unfinished sermons in a lot of ways, to give you simply questions that you can pray about, or you can meditate over, or think about over this few weeks of chaos for most of us as we wait for Christmas. But questions for you to think about. What does it mean for Jesus to enter our world, and what does it mean for Jesus to enter our hearts? And 2 weeks ago, I asked that question. What are we waiting for anyway? In other words, if we are supposed to, in Advent, if we're supposed to be anticipating, waiting, preparing for the birth of Christ, for Christ to enter our world, what specifically are we waiting for anyway? In other words, what do we think will really be different? I mean, is the 26th any different than the 24th of December? Does something actually change, or are we just waiting for Christmas to be over so our in-laws go home, right? I mean, my mother-in-law is going to be here, so keep that to yourselves. So but really, what do we really think is going to change? What are we waiting for to happen this Christmas? That was your question 2 weeks ago. Last week, next slide, please. We talked about. Thank you. We talked about the Roman Empire. And we talked about the Caesars of the time, the world that Jesus was born into. And we're going to talk about that a little more today. But Jesus was born into a world where the Caesars ruled. And Julius Caesar was declared God by the Roman Senate. And then his son, Caesar Augustus, who is the person that Luke mentions in the Gospel of Luke, Luke mentions at the beginning of the Christmas story, he says Caesar Augustus was in charge at the time. And Caesar Augustus, who is Julius Caesar's son, if Julius Caesar is God, then Caesar Augustus was the son of God, which is what all of the coins of the day of during the time when Jesus was born, they all say Caesar Augustus, on the left, and on the backside, son of God. In fact, all of the literature of the time points to Caesar Augustus lifting himself up as the son of God. Next slide. Poet Virgil, one who says about Caesar Augustus that Caesar is the one who is to come, will be the divine king of salvation for whom mankind has waited. Caesar Augustus was understood to be the salvation of the world, and it continues to say, he will annihilate the evil of the past and free the people from unceasing fear. He will establish a universal peace and lead in the golden age for the blessing of a renewed humanity. In a corner of the world, when everybody was saying, Caesar is Lord, some people were whispering, Jesus is Lord. And we talked about how this Roman Empire, this son of God, Caesar Augustus, ruled. He ruled very, very, very brutally. We could go over that again, but to be honest, I don't think we need more than 1 week of that kind of brutality talked about from the pulpit, so to speak, because it was a very difficult, a very dark, a very brutal world to live in. And I asked you this question. Next slide. Who are the oppressed? Meaning in a Roman Empire where the people are oppressed by the Roman government, where if you stepped out of line, they simply killed you. Not just you, but the entire town. These people were an oppressed people, and when they were waiting for Jesus to be born, for the Messiah to come, when they were waiting for change, they were waiting for real change. They weren't waiting just for a new person to worship. And I asked you the question, who are the oppressed today that are waiting for Jesus to enter their lives and really change things? Who are the oppressed today? And that leads us into what we're going to talk about today, which is in some ways similar to last week. Last week we used the Gospel of Luke to launch us off into our discussion about the Roman Empire, about Caesars, and about oppression. And today we're using the Gospel of Matthew, which starts out with, in some sense, a similar line, but with different people and with a slightly different agenda. Where Luke was confronting the oppression of the Roman Empire, the Gospel of Matthew is talking about someone completely different, maybe a different kind of oppression. And so that's where we're going to start today. We're going to start with this person named Herod. Herod the Great is how it starts off. Now, the video I was going to show you was from Jesus Christ Superstar, and it shows the last, when Jesus confronts Herod, and Herod does a little dance and sings a little song and basically taunts Jesus as being king of the Jews. But the Herod that we hear about when Jesus was on trial is actually a different Herod than the one when Jesus was born. When Jesus was born is Herod the Great, and is the father of Herod Antipas, who was the Herod at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. And so this Herod is completely different. He actually died shortly after Jesus was born. But I'm going to give you a ton of information, kind of like last week, about who this Herod was, at least one area. It's going to be like drinking from a fire hose, and then I'm going to ask another question for us to think about over these next few days until we kind of bring everything into focus on Christmas Eve. And the question, we'll get to the question later. So the world that Herod ruled, next slide, was still controlled by the Caesars, was still controlled by the Roman Empire. And as I showed you last week, the world was huge, especially for then. There are no cars, there are no planes, and so basically you walked everywhere or rode a horse, and it's a huge empire. So how do you rule a huge empire when the people that you are ruling are thousands of miles away and you can't pick up the phone? It takes you months to get there. How do you keep them controlled? Well, you have governors, you have puppet kings, so to speak. You pick somebody in each of those areas who you know will do exactly what you want them to. You give them a ton of power as long as they do exactly what you want them to do. And that's how Herod the Great comes to power. There's some wars and some skirmishes there, and trust me, Herod the Great isn't just about power. He's a pretty brutal person himself. But Herod is one of those people who Caesar picks and says, I want you to rule over Judea. So Herod says, awesome, I will do that, and I'm going to do it to the best of my ability, and I'm going to oppress these people, which we're not going to talk so much about that kind of brutal oppression, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to say thank you to you, Caesar. And I'm going to say thank you by building all kinds of things and giving you the credit. So one of the things that Herod the Great did is he put throughout all of Judea statues of Caesar Augustus. Everywhere. I mean, talk about a brown-noser, right? Statues of Caesar Augustus everywhere. But think about this. It's Judea. It's the land of the Jewish people. What are the second and third commandments? Caesar Augustus is known as God on earth, right? And so if you put statues up of him, what you have is a breaking of, you shall have no other gods before me, and make no graven images. How do you think this sits with the Jewish people? I mean, he's brown-nosing Caesar, but he's not doing a lot of favors for the Jews. But nonetheless, Herod the Great, he wants to be the great, and so he embarks on this building campaign, all in honor of Caesar. Next slide. He goes to this place called Masada. Has anyone heard of Masada? Seriously, anybody? Hands? Nope. Oh, only a few of you. Masada is this plateau in the middle of nowhere. You can see it's almost impossible to get to it. And it is known in legend and lore as the place that King David would hide out at, so no one could find him. When there were skirmishes with different peoples and before he came to power, and I'm talking about King David as in David and Goliath, King David, he would hide out on this place. And so Herod says, hey, if David can hang out there, then I'm going to go and build a palace on it. If David's going to hide out there, then I'm going to live in luxury on that place. Now, that doesn't look like the kind of place that you'd want to live in luxury. It looks like you'd have to do a lot of work to live in luxury on that place. And that's exactly what he does. He builds, the whole top was a big palace with marble columns. Next slide, please. That are all over the place, building this elaborate palace with pools, with hot tubs. Next slide. With big open areas that people could live in. 1,000 people would live on top of Masada. And it was covered in marble and gold and mosaics and all kinds of things. And then you have to say, all right, so he built this big palace. He probably didn't really live there anyway, but it's in the middle of the desert. How in the world are you going to make sure everybody has enough water? Where Herod the Great, being the builder that he is, says, you know what? It doesn't rain a lot. There isn't a lot of water, but what I can do is I can basically, re-engineer the landscape for a couple miles around Masada, so that all of the rainwater flows towards the base of Masada. Next slide. And then I'm going to carve out these big cisterns in the bottom of Masada so that all that rainwater fills up these big containers, basically, so that we can hold enough water for 1,000 men for 10 years. So the legend has it. I don't think it's that much, but that's what they said. I mean, if you're not taking showers and you're not flushing toilets, the water could go a lot longer, but nonetheless, he took care of everything, even to the point where they found food that was still preserved. In 1960, some archaeologists found some food, like dates and figs and things like that, in order, that he would preserve. So lots of people could live in this elaborate palace on this middle of the nowhere plateau called Masada. And King Herod built all of this. And he took all of what he learned from Rome and all of that power and influence, and he built something that really never should have been built. Next slide. He also wanted to continue brown-nosing the Caesar Augustus, and so he built himself a city on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, a city that he dedicated to Caesar. So, of course, if you're going to dedicate something to Caesar, what are you going to call it? Caesarea. Right? Caesarea. Caesarea is an incredible city that was built by Herod the Great. And everything was done over the top, to be honest, including the harbor. The harbor that he built, this is actually the newer harbor. To see the harbor that Herod built, you actually have to use a satellite image because it's more than twice as big. Next slide. You can see under the water are the old walls of the old harbor. You can see how much bigger Herod the Great's harbor was. Out on the very point, he built another palace, go figure. And at one location there, he actually built a pool that was surrounded on 3 sides by salt water, but he didn't want a saltwater pool, he wanted a freshwater pool. So he built a pool in the middle of the harbor on one of those, the piers or whatever that pier is, but one of the land that goes out in the middle, and he wanted that freshwater pool, so he had to bring in fresh water to do that. But before we even show how he did that, all of that earth that he created to create that harbor, he actually, and the Romans knew how to do hydraulic concrete. So they could pour concrete underwater and have it harden 2,000 years ago. And they would pour these blocks and create these blocks that were 50 tons. And what are they? How big are they? 39 feet by 49 feet by 5 feet. And just scores of them to build up the land in this harbor so that he could have this just an enormous port. But again, I talked about the fresh water, and so there's no fresh water. He's on the sea. It's all salt water. So how do you get fresh water there? Well, the nearest source is 13 miles away. So if you're Herod the Great, this isn't a problem. Next slide. You build an aqueduct 13 miles long. Every mile it goes down 1 centimeter. It's only off by about 1 centimeter over 13 miles. That's how you get fresh water to a place that has no fresh water. And when you're Herod the Great, you earn the title the Great by building these incredible things. Getting a picture of who Herod the Great is, what he accomplished, how he earned. He also in Caesarea, he built a theater. It's about 5,000, seats about 5,000. And if you stand in the middle as an orator, if you stand there, you don't need a microphone. If I just spoke there, if you're on the top row as far away as you can get, the acoustics are so perfect you could hear it. That's the kind of building he did. He also, remember, he wasn't in favor, if you will, with the Jews because he built all those statues. Next slide. So he also then decided, I'm going to make the Jews happy, so I'm going to build the Temple Mount 3 times bigger than it was. And so now, of course, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem has the Dome of the Rock on it, but you can see kind of a square around the Dome of the Rock. Herod built it out to the bigger rectangle that you see. It's huge. And you can see houses around it. So you think of those houses and how small the houses are and then how big that Temple Mount is. Of course, the religious authorities in Jerusalem are happy. He put all this money and this energy into the Temple Mount. So he's kind of playing both sides. He's brown-nosing Caesar and he's kind of brown-nosing the Jewish authorities as well. So he put lots of money and energy into the Temple Mount. He also built this thing called the Herodium. He wanted a palace between his hometown and Jerusalem. Except for he wanted a palace on a mountain. The problem is, there's no mountain between his hometown and Jerusalem. So if you're Herod and you want a palace on a mountain and there's no mountain, what do you think you're going to do? You're going to build a mountain. Next slide. This is called the Herodium. There's a palace that goes on top. I could tell you how lavish that thing was, but it's gone now and it's all being excavated. But he built this mountain. He basically took earth from one place and put it in another. Next slide, you can see it better, what that looks like in the middle of nowhere. Some people say, and I don't know how true this is, I really don't, but it's a fun legend to point out that this was, you could see this from all over the countryside. In that next slide, when Jesus tells that parable or talks about that story where he's quoted as saying this, truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what is done to the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, Herodium, Go throw yourself into the sea and it will be done. In other words, if you think Herod can build this mountain, with faith that mountain can come down. It wasn't just any mountain. I don't know how true that is, but I like it. I like it. That's the kind of world that Jesus is born into. There's the Roman world we talked about last week, but there's also this governor Herod who's doing all this building, all of this incredible stuff. And that is the world that Jesus is born into. Next slide. The problem is this: how do you pay for it? Taxes. Except for the problem is that Rome was already taxing people at an incredible amount, at a high level, to pay for all those legions that were oppressing people, torturing people, wiping towns out, basically to keep people just afraid enough not to mess with Rome. And so there's already high taxes. And so then here you are, you're being taxed by Rome. And then along comes King Herod, or Herod the Great, who is building all of these things, who now needs all of this tax money to pay for all those elaborate, lavish building projects he has. And what you can imagine is how people feel when stuff is taken away. And so another landscape to paint for you is that many say that most of the people, 80% to 90%, were in agriculture. That very few people actually lived in the cities. And when people were taxed, it was usually taxed of the goods that they produced, right? So if most people are taxed are agriculture people, and very few people live in the cities, that means very few people are enjoying the lavish cities and that kind of lifestyle at the expense of everybody else. In other words, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And the rich are getting to be a fewer number with a greater amount of wealth, and the poor are becoming a greater amount of people with a lower amount of wealth. And Herod had these people called tax collectors. We've heard of these. If you grew up in the church and you've heard parable after parable, you've heard tax collectors. And this is exactly how it worked. Herod's tax collector comes up to you. You're a fisherman. You've been fishing all night for your family. You're trying to provide. You're trying to take care of everybody. And you catch, let's say, 10 fish. And Herod's tax collector comes up to you and says, all right, you've caught about 10 fish. 5 of those go to Caesar because, Caesar is son of God, right? He's godly, so that's 5. Herod is building this mountain, so I need 3 fish to pay for that. And I'm a tax collector, and I need to get paid, so I'm going to take a fish because I need my money. And that leaves you with 1. Okay, 1 fish. Good luck. Have a good night. I mean, what does that do to you as a people? To see these few amount of people enjoying this phenomenal luxury, and you're being taxed for it all, and you see none of it. These are some of Herod's coins. It is this environment that Jesus is born into, not just the Roman environment, but the local environment of Judea with a governor, with a king, Herod the Great, who builds these incredible things and makes everyone else pay for it. Next slide. It is in this environment that the Roman Senate, the same Senate that declared Caesar God, declares Herod king of the Jews. The same Senate that declares Caesar God is the Senate that declares Herod King of the Jews, an important title bestowed. That is the background that the author, Matthew, writes this gospel. It is the background that the reader understands. Next slide. And so when we open this text, in the time of King Herod, all that baggage comes into play. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? King meant something. We have all kinds of Camelot images of king. But king there was basically a title that said, who's in control? Who's in charge? Who's in control of Judea is King Herod. And people are whispering, King of the Jews belongs to Jesus. I bring all of this up to ask our last question of this Advent season. It's the question of control. I could ask, who is your king? But I don't think that metaphor works very well today. But a king in a Herod the Great is a person who is in control of your finances, in control of the world in which you live, in control of your security, in control of your safety, in control of whatever kind of movement you can make up or down the social scale. This person is in control, and Matthew is asking the reader, who is your king? So instead of asking you who is your king today, I'm going to ask you who is in control, or maybe better said, what's in control of your life? What's in control of your life? When Jesus enters your life, the new king, what has to be moved aside? What are you holding on to? What's holding on to you? What is controlling you that will be at odds with Jesus when Jesus enters your heart and your world this year? Is it ego? Is it money? Maybe it's something like alcoholism or drugs. Maybe it's pride. What controls you now, and what has to be given up when a new king comes to town? What controls you this year? Let us pray. Creator God, we thank you for all that you are, for entering a dark world of oppression and control and casting just a little bit of light on the reality in which we live. We ask that you give us the courage to struggle with those questions. What do we think will change? Who are the oppressed, and what is it that controls us? Give us the courage to face those questions, to confront those questions. And let us have the courage to deal with them as you enter our lives and confront them with just a little bit of light. What is it that controls us, God? Is it you? Give us courage to face that question. In your name we pray.